Testing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And this is an interview with Mr. John Topley for the Griffith University Jubilee History, taped at Fig Tree Pocket in Brisbane on Monday, 22nd of January 1996 with Dr. O'Quirk. Okay. Mr. Topley, is there anything you would like to add or elaborate or correct in regard to the interview you did in 1993 with Patience Holmes, which covered, generally speaking, the area up to the departure of Vice-Chancellor John Willett?
Maybe I'd just say a few words about what I think Griffith University set out to be, because it's perhaps against that some measure of development can be spoken about. It's important, I think, to know that we were coming out of a time when there'd been an enormous amount of social conflict, the end of the Vietnam moratorium, and with that, of course, were enormous social changes. And early in the planning period of the university, the long-standing Liberal Country Party government in Australia changed, and there was the first Labor government under Whitlam, who led to, I think, a resurgence in Australian nationalism. So there was this background, and the university was, in many respects, a reaction to the criticism of the way higher education institutions, universities in particular, conducted themselves, and the innate conservatism and self-interest of university staff, which still prevails. So, the other important thing to say is that the university was, in its essence, planned before it had any staff. And it's perhaps important to realise that more than in any other case I know of in the history of modern universities in Australia, the character of this university is set by the founding interim council before the Vice-Chancellor was appointed, and indeed before any staff was. There were a few of us eventually assisting the interim council, but we were all appointed to the staff of the University of Queensland or seconded from it. Now, the main character, I think, of the university then was that it wanted to be much more student-focused. It wanted to pay much more attention to the needs of part-time students. It wanted students to feel much more as if they were participants in their own education and recipients of packages. It wanted a governance structure which was more involving, participative, consultative, and it wanted to recognise that knowledge, recorded knowledge, had begun to accumulate at such a rate that it was clear, for that reason alone, apart from the many other reasons we know about, that focusing on course content was a thing of the past, and that the university ought to be very consciously and deliberately focusing on the procedures and sets of mind that people needed in order to discover knowledge and retain it and go about some vocation or other. And also it ought to be done outside the boundaries of what we regarded as the conservative and somewhat reactionary disciplines. And therefore, we wanted to be interdisciplinary and distinct across disciplines, and we wanted integration. And the reason, or the means of getting integration, was to shy away from a focus on content and move towards the examination of intellectual, academic, or big social problems around which we could accumulate whatever methodologies, areas of expertise, or bodies of knowledge were necessary to address. And that, for me, was the central difference between Griffith University on the one hand and by then just about every other Australian university, because some of the others who had tried it, like La Trobe and Flinders, were being very receptive very quickly. And we were conscious of that, and from all of that we were led into a very careful and deliberate concern about the academic structure and procedures and philosophy of the university, the physical character of the university, which we wanted to be such as would reinforce those central intellectual objectives, and also the means of governance and administration. I'll give you just one example of the approach we took, and this was that instead of borrowing other people's statutes and regulations, which was typically the case with the University of Australia, we decided we would write everything from scratch so that we wouldn't import unconsciously organisational philosophies, attitudes and values that are always written in documents. So it was with the existence of a philosophy and then an implementation and developmental process which we had adopted, which was designed to make sure that the philosophy didn't fall by the wayside because we did things in ways which were not appropriate for that philosophy. We were lucky. I suppose one of my contributions was to work for a 4-year planning period and talk to Commonwealth and Topley to take 4 years to do it, so that we could in fact do academic planning first and then let the physical and organisational and governmental structures of the university work out from that. And I suppose I'd also want to say that in that first year, the interim council and I set down a lot of the government structures with all of that in mind. For example, the committee system, the committee's advisory council, which prevailed probably for more than a decade, were developed in those times. And those committees included quite unusual committees for Australian universities. One was the Student Affairs Committee, which was designed to look at this question, partly doing the right for students. And another committee which was called an organisation committee, which was actually designed to look from the point of view of organisation theory at whether the way the university was being structured in terms of its total operations was right for its philosophy. And this was a very unusual thing. The other thing I suppose we ought to say was from the very beginning there was a strong emphasis on breaking down the traditional separation between academic and general staff so that we regarded everyone as being in the professional service of the university contributing to those general objectives. So I suppose, that's the very important set of fundamentals on which the university is based. Just to stop there for a minute.
Yes, that's great.
The interim council, when it had sorted out the sort of university it wanted to be, and it did this in fairly general terms, although there were very firm views expressed in those terms. It didn't develop, for example, degree programs in detail, although it did work out before our first Vice Chancellor arrived that it wanted to be concerned with the big question of the evolution and development of the Australian culture, which led to really demanding. It wanted to look at the question of the environment, but to do so in a respectable way, which led to the School of Australian Environmental Studies being formed. It wanted to look at Australia and the Pacific, and was talked out of that by Gordon Greenwich, and eventually settled on Australia and Asia, and Ted Bray was very keen proponent of that line. And we also realised, almost by default, that we couldn't really do without the physical sciences. So then it became necessary to start recruiting people who would put all of this into effect. We early on recruited a marvellous site planner, Mr. Roger Johnson, who had a great image which he developed from the feeling that the planners said they wanted to achieve. I might, as an aside here, comment that when we took over the site at Nathan, we inherited some works that had been done by other people. The Coordinator General of Queensland had the custodianship of the site, so early Commonwealth money had been allocated. And James Birrell, then architect of the University of Queensland, had been commissioned to draw a few lines on the site, and he drew a ring road rather similar to the ring road at the USQ. And so we inherited this high-speed highway around the site. And it would have led us, we felt, to a physical development quite unsuited to the kind of integrated university we wanted to create. And so Roger Johnson's great contribution is get the present concept of the central pedestrian spine path onto which the major activities, the interdisciplinary, problem-oriented activities of the university will be physically housed and the students will flow out and start into this very compact, highly dense population, rather than, if I can quote the chairman of the Interim Council, Ted Rowe, like a lot of bloody bulls camps in the bush, which he felt the University of Queensland was. So the idea was then that we would create a physical housing for staff and students engaged in the study and learning in each of those major intellectual themes, which meant that unlike the University of Queensland, they wouldn't be darting like butterflies from flower to flower, picking up a bit here and there in departments. They and the staff would work together very closely in the one physical environment, but would mix with the rest of the university in this village-like pedestrian spine path, which was separated from vehicular traffic. And although I'm getting a bit aside from where I started, that was given social sense by creating a big shared common room in each of those buildings, where staff and students, each working in the one general problem area, would share their recreation time. And you can see there as an example of how we wanted to give physical manifestation to the sort of educational and academic philosophy. Okay, so going back now to this question of pointing the right people to the good on. So Roger Johnson, we all thought was obviously the right man to get hold of that philosophy and draw the site plan. He stayed with us for some years, not too many, probably just long enough because he was really more of an ideas, conceptual planner, at which he did a most magnificent job, but I think he became bored with the mere building of buildings and engaging in committee festivities. Right, so Roger came, and towards the end of the first year, when the office was located in the state government offices at the university, and we then set about searching for a Vice-Chancellor. We searched worldwide, including using the Association of Commonwealth Universities in London. Now, if you've heard all of this from Ted Bray, I could condense this a bit.
From the search I have heard the details from Ted Bray about the search for a Vice-Chancellor.
So I'll cut that bit back.
But possibly one thing that you might like to maybe elaborate slightly on, cut that one back, would be the actual procedure for selection of the interim council. Was that?
All right, yes, I can go back to that in a minute. But I'll just make one or two comments about Vice-Chancellor and close that off then. There was a division in the interim council about whether we wanted an academic as Vice-Chancellor. There was a feeling, which I think was essentially correct, although not in a particular case, as it turned out, that an academic Vice-Chancellor would be conservative, and any academic Vice-Chancellor would be conservative, and too much in the grip of the culture from which he had emerged. And I might say that's a personal belief which I still strongly hold. I think most Vice-Chancellors are impotent because they're in the grip of the culture from which they come.
Very valid point, I would have thought.
So there was first a debate about whether we wanted an external, a non-academic. And this was quite a heated debate, and indeed the non-academic did apply. But eventually the academics won the day, and we got a short list of academics from which Professor John Willett was chosen. he came highly recommended, including a wonderful reference from Sir Robert Menzies, which I think was pretty influential with the state government at the time. Okay, well, we ended up there, of course, with someone who had had experience in industry, and to some extent was a good candidate considering the sorts of wishes that the Interim Council generally had. The choice of the members of the Interim Council, there were two people in mind to be selected as chair. One was Ted Bray, and the other was another person whose name I don't know. It might have been Colonel Gus Gurman, who was the Deputy Chancellor of the University of Queensland.
Yes.
If you want to sniff around, you might be able to find
I'll
that
be
out.
able to find that out. It's more for the definitive history than this one, but yes.
Yeah, I would ask Ted Bray.
Yes, I will. Yeah.
And Ted Bray was approached. Of course, he was former Editor-in-Chief, Managing Editor of the Courier Mail. And he accepted after initial reluctance. And the impression I have is that he was pretty influential in choosing his own interim council. In fact, I think he might have made that a condition with the then Education Minister, Alan Fletcher, who was a Country Party Education Minister, whose mother had been a school teacher and who had considerable regard for education in a sort of mystical way.
Yes.
And Ted chose some business people whom he had regard, and he took advice around the traps and got some academics. And he got Val Presley because Val was a thoughtful person about universities and education, and keen on the student side of life. And he got Peter Mason from Macquarie University, who was Professor of Physics at Macquarie, because Peter was, again, one of these futurists who was very strong on the need for interdisciplinarity, the changing character of knowledge. He brought all of this sort of thinking. He got Steve Lipton, who was a statistical mathematician, professor at UQ. I think because Steve was a thoughtful, balanced cynic. Very nice man. I got on very well with Steve. We were often at loggerheads, but we quite enjoyed one another. And Jack Campbell, I think because he was a professor of education. Molly Woods-Olson, because she was a woman and head of women's college at the University of Queensland. Len Butts, an old-time mate of Ted Bray's, who was a retired senior partner of Morris Fletcher and Cross, for that sort of reason. You want any more on this?
No, might I just ask, Ted Bray, and I think you mentioned here that Ted felt very strongly that he should have more non-academics than academics. And one of the questions that occurs to me is, it seems, if I'm elaborating too much here or asking to go into too much detail, just tell me, but I'm finding difficulty with Ted Bray and his view of the world, and the people he got together, and the philosophy. Now, I've tried to work this out, and it seems to me that what he wanted did fit into his philosophy, but it probably wasn't quite the same as the way Val Presley would have seen the world, or Peter Mason, and I'm wondering how this sort of fitted together. Does that question make sense?
It does. No one dominated the Interim Council.
Right.
It was one of the best constructive developmental groups I've ever worked with. And that sort of clarified my own role. I was very young, very early 30s, I think. I'd been Zelman Khan's executive assistant and Sir Fred Chanel's before that. And I'd come out of the background of teaching and training at a part-time which led me into sociology of educational organisation. And my job with John and Town was really to read the world literature on higher education and assist him by feeding it into his vice-chancellorial processes and writing speeches and that sort of thing. So I came with that background. And I was very fortunate the interim council allowed me to make substantial contributions in my own way into their work. So we worked as a very happy team. And I suppose I wouldn't take credit for most of what was written by the interim council because the people who were in it were writers too. Ted encouraged everyone to write. But my role might have been perhaps to consolidate, coordinate, meld, and also to write some stuff myself. So I'm definitely not trying to overstate my effort.
No.
But to say it was a nice team effort.
Oh, good.
Yeah. Now, back to your question of how they got to that philosophy. Ted did not try to impose his own substantial views. He is, as you've probably worked out, a fairly forthright, concise man. He would give his own views, but he always deferred to the others and said, I've got you here because I think your views are important. This is what I feel, but I want to hear. I want you to criticise. So it was the best of the intellectual approaches, I think, that we as people who understand academia would have wanted. And so people flourished in that. And there was a lot of learning. He gave time for learning. The academics on the board instructed the non-academics. The non-academics instructed the academics in what the community was feeling about education. It was, of course, a big topic in that era. And so I suppose we would say that outsiders would make comments like, we can't ignore Asia. We must be involved with Asia. All this stuff about the environment. Can't we get something decent about the environment instead of these, they weren't called greenies in those days, these rat bags holding up traffic downtown. And we can't ignore the great threads of European culture which have contributed to what we are. And we must have the hard stuff as well. That would all have come from outside. And then the sort of reaction that would typically come from inside would be, yes, we understand what you mean about not having just the soft end of the environment. What we need is the application of the scientific method, both in the area of social fact and in the area of physical fact, in that study. And therefore what we would probably look at would be a range of disciplinary support from the biophysical through to the socio-political. And those terms were actually the terms used from the biophysical through to the socio-political, working in an integrated way to take account of the complexity of the environmental issue. And this concern about the complexity of the major problems in the world was one of the driving forces in developing that academic philosophy. To deal with the complex issues, we couldn't rely on single disciplines, or even single disciplines trying to work together, because they didn't understand one another's epistemologies and methodologies and so on. So then you get Peter Mason saying, well, yes, we understand the need for good technological contributions from the university, but technology and knowledge are burgeoning so much that we need to produce a type of scientist who understands the social impact of science, can talk to people, but also have the rigours of the discipline of the physical sciences. So there was that conversation went on for that year, and out of that emerged that manifestation. There were people like me and Peter Mason and Val Presley and others saying, what about the students? And Molly Woodwell, and saying, and we were all conscious of how students were saying what rotten teaching and again, how irrelevant things were. And I, as an external student, a part-time student, fully sympathised. I had had rotten teaching in the history department of the university. And so we were all of the view that we wanted people who actually wanted to teach students well. So it was that set of conversations that led to a philosophy that was not Ted Bray's or that of any member of that group. It was truly one of the most effective team-developed and shared philosophies. Now it seems to me that the long time we allowed ourselves, those 4 years, were absolutely critical in getting this to work, because we had one whole year in which the interim council itself had time to work that out. Compared with Macquarie University, which I think the government decided about the middle of 1 year would open at the beginning of the first term for next year. And that was the other end of the scale. All they could do was be import modules and other people's things and try and put them together.
That's absolutely fine. You'll take a bit of a break.
Yes.
With reference to the VC appointment.
The VC appointment is really now post the appointment. So a couple of things. Once the VC arrived, he took over the direction of the academic and total planning of the university. And he was able to comprehend the totality of it because he was both a manager and an academic. Thank you, Sybil. But he drew on some of the members of the interim council. He would meet with 2 or 3. And we also started... Excuse me, Sybil? Yes, I'm talking about John Willett and his contribution. So he then started work developing what each of those areas of academic interest would turn out to be, and writing courses. And also, he led a rapid movement towards getting hold of the foundation staff for each of those schools, because we wanted them to own what was being created there, and we were reacting to advice from Peter Carmel, saying that it was very important that the head of each of the foundation academic elements be deeply involved in planning for it. And I think he had had an experience of things where he'd appointed heads after the schools had been planned and then had great managerial difficulties, which is obvious when you think about it. So we set out to recruit the 8 foundation professors, and John Willett had a big role to play in that. And I'm leading in this direction to indicate the character of his management in the early days. He was fully in tune with the interim council's wish to take an integrated approach to the creation of the whole institution. He strongly supported the regard given to the whole staff of the university. He strongly supported the integrated approach, and he understood the importance of the organisational culture in achieving the results that he wanted to achieve in research and academic behaviour and in student benefit. So it was a very happy choice of Vice Chancellor. He was also a pretty dominating and forthright and self-opinionated person. And he and Ted Bray, I think, measured one another and realised they were going to have some fun. Ted Bray was never loath to pull John up, and John was never loath to tell Bray where to get off. But they did it in a very civilised way. I know they had some pretty heated conversations privately, but they were sufficiently fond of one another and in sympathy with one another and in mutual recognition of the other's strengths and real wish to make Griffith University successful, that they worked as a fantastic team. For example, in council, unlike the present Vice-Chancellor, John Willett insisted on sitting at the other end of the table from the Chancellor, so that he, as the Chief Executive of the University, was answerable to the whole Council. He wasn't sitting in the pocket of the Chancellor, and frankly that produced a very healthy situation at the Council. But Ted and John used to play it like a piece of theatre, where Ted would ask the Vice-Chancellor quite hard questions, and John would answer them or deal with them. Other members of the council were encouraged to ask the hard questions, and they did. But whenever it looked as if the Vice-Chancellor wasn't ready to answer the question, the Chancellor would instantly spot this and say to the council, well, members of the council, we've raised a very important issue here, and I think we need a considered response to this. I wonder if I could ask you, Vice-Chancellor, if you'd consult with your officers and bring a response to the next meeting of the council. And the Vice-Chancellor would say, yes, Mr. Chancellor, it would be my pleasure to do that. And you can understand from that example how they played it in the interests of the university and in maintaining each other's authority.
That came through from what Ray said.
And that was the healthiest the council has ever been. In my opinion, the council has declined in strength and health since that time.
Could I interrupt with a comment that you might like to directly do with that? I spoke with Peter Hobart yesterday or the day before, on Saturday, and one of the strongest points he made both about the early days and today, and leaving out the difficulties of the Gold Coast situation itself, was that his council in the very early days made decisions. They didn't rubber stamp anything, whereas now he feels that he's a rubber stamp in the university in Griffith, that the council is simply a rubber stamp, but he doesn't know where the decisions originate. It's in a fuzzy haze, and they come around to people and they rubber stamp them. He doesn't feel that he's participating in the decision making. It sounds to me that's a similar situation to the very early Griffith Council and the Crown Council.
I don't know how Peter Hobart managed it, but we deliberately constructed the council in a way that the members were participants.
Yeah.
And that's been deliberately deconstructed by the present Vice-Chancellor and his offsides.
Right. Yeah.
And I'll spend just a second on that.
Please do.
Part of our organisational work, because I was interested in organisations, John Willett was too, and their dynamics, we gave a lot of thought to how to do this. And we kept a small council. That was the interim council's wish to have, I think it was 22 members of the governing body. Keep it small. And we constructed a number of committees that I previously referred to, which were committees of the council. The other important principle was that we didn't have a professorial board, because in John Willett's view, there was that bifurcated governance and the gap in between where neither wanted to take responsibility. And so what we did was to make the professorial board a much smaller thing called an academic committee, on which the professoriate didn't have the right to sit anyhow. And all of these were responsible to the governing body. But we made sure that on each of those committees were 2 or 3 members of the governing body who sat as full participants. For example, there were 3 or 4 members of the council, including some non-academic members of the council, who sat on the academic committee. And the purpose of that was so that the governing body would always feel that it had 3 or 4 of its people who participated in the preparation of the recommendations that came to the governing body. And the other thing we did was to make sure that the chairs of each of those committees was a member of the governing body, so that you were getting the recommendation from the horse's mouth, and that if there was discussion on the council, there were at least 2 or 3 other members of the council who'd been there when the decision was made, who could help explain it to the council. Now that was a deliberate, structural act based on organisation theory to overcome the problem that we've just referred to. And I'm afraid, with people coming in to the chancellorship, the vice-chancellorship, to senior office in the university, and by the undermining effect of, I'll come back to again, of academics who wanted to turn the university back into a traditional sort of university, that's all conspired to reduce the salience of the council's work. So Peter's dead right.
Yes. I'll just turn that off for a second now.
Going back now to the very beginning of John Willett's reign, and to indicate the global nature of his concern about the university, we appointed 8 foundation professors as quickly as we could, and we used selection methods which were quite unusual in that we, having received an expression of interest from people, and we received a very large number, we then got people to do quite an amount of critical essay writing about the ideas that Griffith had, on the ground that if they couldn't re-articulate in a convincing way the aspects of what we wanted to do, then we probably had the wrong person. Because re-articulation seemed to us to be a very important aspect, a character of the earlier point, is a capacity to not only understand what we were doing, but to re-express it, and to demonstrate how they would apply that philosophy in the work they did.
Right.
And some people just refused to do it, which was fine by us. Yes. And I think that's one of the failures that we've had in the university, that succeeding waves of people engaged in the selection process have let all of that lapse. My personal view is that there is an aspect of the academic culture which makes it almost a taboo to question other academics about how they do things. You can question them about their disciplinary activities, but you can't question them about their academic activities. And I believe we didn't work hard enough to socialise the new members of the university into the organisational processes needed to sustain the academic philosophy, and particularly to continue to appoint people who would be both good academics and would carry the torch. And I think that's a critical failure in the work. And John Willett was as responsible for that as anyone else. And he and I one day had a conversation about it, which got very close to admitting that he found it uncomfortable trying to socialise that. I think vice chancellors are very vulnerable to criticism by their own academics. And I think he was starting to feel, coming back from the academic mass, some resistance to continuing socialisation.
Yeah. Could I interrupt there and again jump ahead of things? There was a gradual, very gradual view seeming to come to me, allowed to come to me, that this is something that is totally the responsibility of Roy Webb. This is beginning to sort of trickle through to me. So this, that is in one of the supplementary questions I have here. So this re-socialization to some degree to traditional universities did have its beginning with during Willard's reign.
More by omission.
Yeah.
I think with Roy Webb it would be by commission.
Yeah.
So that's how I would divide it.
Yes.
And we did this with senior general staff as well. We wanted general staff who could understand that they were not working just as an accountant, but who were working as an accountant in an organisation designed to bring about certain behavioural outcomes.
From the academic, sorry, I'm interrupting you.
That's okay, I don't mind.
Is that okay?
Yes,
From the academic point of view, would David Saunders be a person to talk to about those early days?
Certainly would, yeah.
Yeah.
I'd like to nominate 2 other people to talk
Please
about
do.
the early days. One is Dr. Bob Ross, Professor Bob Ross.
He's on my list.
Yes. He's an art cynic. He was one of the very early appointees. And he's typical of the sort of person that John Willett could manage and Roy Webb could never manage. But Bob is the questioner, the arch reflector on the question, the bot fly. Very intelligent. And John Willett used to use him. He used to set him up to do that sort of thing. And he would use him in academic committee. Bob would raise the question and then John would manage the feelings of the person who'd been questioned.
Yeah.
And it was all to the benefit of the university.
Sure.
One of Roy's salient characteristics is the inability to defend himself in public, and a great feeling of discomfort.
Yes.
So having someone like that stand up in academic committee and say, but Vice Chancellor, how could you possibly say that? Because the implication will be, what do you have to say about that?
Yes.
It's something that Roy could never handle.
So he has to find it. Yeah, I would.
So he has to ease him out of the organisation.
Yeah. Yeah. So Bob Ross, David Saunders, and
Ian Barham.
That name I've come across.
He was also in the Centre for the Advancement of Learning and Teaching.
Yeah.
Rose to be a Pro Vice Chancellor.
Yeah.
And then I think retired because he didn't like the way the university was developed.
Yes, I've come across his name quite a bit with the amalgamation. Okay, that's...
I'm just thinking of other people who are... Has anyone spoken to you about Arthur Brownlee, Professor Arthur Brownlee in AES? He would be a good person to speak to.
Right. No, his name has cropped up, but I don't...
He's one of the foundation professors, Professor Arthur Brownlee. And another one would be Professor Colin McKerris.
Yes.
In population studies.
Professor Brownlee is retired.
No, he's still there. Professor Calvin Rose is still there. He was the foundation chair at AES, and he's still on the staff there.
And McKerris and Rose are still there.
Yes.
Yeah. I've actually deliberately left the academic staff from my very early discussions.
Well, I want certain logic in doing that if you're looking at a progressive history.
Absolutely. And there are other rationales too, as you can well imagine.
Oh, we might deal with the less worthy.
Very possibly. I'm probably going to... I spoke to David Saunders on the phone. I'll just turn around briefly.
They also were brought to Brisbane. They were brought here for a long period of time. They were interviewed exhaustively, but also they were entertained at dinners, and Jean Willis, John Willis' wife, played a big role with the members of the interim council in giving these people a very exhaustive selection process, where we tried to drink them under the table, and those who survived.
Very Oxfordish, that.
Yes. And then Jean also played a very big role in helping with the arrival of the foundation professors and their families. Because she formed a group made up of other people's wives, including mine. And we hired houses for them, and we got a store of cutlery and blankets and all that sort of stuff. And she and John always said, most Australians have no idea how difficult it is moving to a new culture. Let's welcome our foundation professors, those who come from another place, and make them feel that we really want them to be part of our lives here. Yeah. And I just think it ought to be acknowledged that she played this very, very significant role. Yeah. At times she was regarded as being a bit dominant and controlling, but I more attribute that as a marginal thing rather than the central contribution she made.
Right. No, I picked that up in what you said, and also Ed Price. No, that's fine. So you eventually got on to teaching?
Yes, we eventually got on to teaching.
Or am I jumping ahead of you?
No. And the way in which we were to teach and the way in which we were to construct courses was discussed endlessly by that group of foundation professors, myself, the Vice Chancellor, and a few members of the interim council. Ted Bray used to be in just about every day, participating. He was a very participative Chancellor in the making. And Ralph Presley was very strong in this. Peter Mason was very strong. I had my own ideas because of my educational teaching background. John Willis had his ideas. And out of this developed a degree pattern where every student in each school would do one common first year. Would be divided into two parts. One which would be a general introduction to the range of disciplines involved in the problem. I suppose an introduction to the problem would be a good way of saying it. And the other was the giving of some academic tools which would be required to operate on the problem. And then they could choose some themes agreed that honours would be additive rather than concurrent. So having done that, the foundation professors were then off developing their programs within the 4 schools. And it worked in this very evolutionary, very discursive way in which people absolutely had to defend their ideas. It wasn't an isolated 1 or 2 people working out what humanities was doing. Every other professor, the Vice-Chancellor, myself, 1 or 2 other members of the General Staff that had then arrived, a couple of members of the interim, would be looking at the whole thing. So no one got away with anything. And it was a very tight operation. It took a long time. So by about the end of the 2nd year, we got to that stage. And then there was the beginning of further staff being recruited. And physical development was going on apace. We were writing statutes. I was, as registrar, was involved heavily in documenting what we were doing, as well as trying to attend committee meetings. And we deliberately wrote very expansive minutes because we believed that a conclusive minute was no help. It was the provenance of the decision which was the important thing. And we've been criticised since then for writing those sorts of minutes. But they were an important part.
Very useful for a historian.
So I wrote a good part of the early number, but then I got some good staff and we wrote. I always used to go over to those and the Vice-Chancellor paid particular attention to them because they were, in fact, the developing doctrine.
Yes, absolutely. It's very clear. That's what it's done too.
So we started to teach, I suppose, not until 1975 though. But I was losing the thread a little bit. John Lewis was a dominant person, but he didn't exercise his dominance through autocratic direction. I think he got his way on most things. But he used to make sure that things were properly presented in committees and that they were fully thrashed about there. He would achieve that by writing a paper himself. He wrote tirelessly, more than any other Vice-Chancellor I know, and I've worked for about 6 or 7 Vice-Chancellors. He just believed that unless he could write his ideas down, they probably weren't good ideas. I must say that's an idea I've adopted for him. If you can't write it, maybe you don't know it.
No, exactly.
And he used to encourage all the foundation professors to write. He encouraged me to write. And the papers would come to the committees and they'd be torn to pieces. And you'd go away with your tail between your legs, write it again, and bring it back. And so John would particularly encourage people he thought who had the right ideas, according to him. And he was an effective debater with good ideas, and people recognised this. So where he won a point, it wasn't resented. People would say, maybe, oh, the old bugger's done it again.
Yes.
But he'd done it again.
Yes.
It wasn't something that you suddenly found out was happening or had been slipped into the system or he and the Chancellor had worked out between them. Ted Bray didn't believe in this either. In those days we used to have a meeting of the Management Advisory Committee, which was the heads, general staff and academic, of the university every Monday morning at 8:30. Chancellor used to turn up for these. So there'd be Vice-Chancellor in the chair, the 4 heads of the general divisions, librarian, site and buildings manager, business manager and registrar, the 4 chairs of the schools, and the Chancellor. And that was an advisory committee with very limited power, but of course, in terms of informal power, it was about the most powerful body in the university.
Oh, I can well imagine.
And there was a place for trial balloons and kites.
Absolutely, yeah.
And for people to be told, look, the way you're going about doing that is really starting to be a problem.
Oh, dear.
Yes, and the Chancellor was there.
Yeah.
So he knew the nuances of all the interactions. He put in his own 2 pennies without any hesitation.
again interrupting, but a hands-on chancellor like that was inevitable with Ted Bray being the founder, but a founding chancellor is a unique situation. I mean, you wouldn't expect another chancellor to be like that, I don't think.
Historically, you wouldn't. Yeah. I think it's important that they be increasingly that way in the future, because my own view is that the universities are the only remaining unreformed major public industry in Australia. And the boards have to be reformed, and the chancellors and members of councils of universities have to have a completely new view about what their responsibility is, which is much greater than much of the exercise. And I think vice chancellors and senior university staff have to learn to work with effective interfering boards.
Okay. Now, the actual physical start of the university, is that the next stage? And or again, is there anything that you wanted to?
I suppose. No, I don't think I have much to say about that, except Roger Johnson was an inspired planner. John Willett backed him. The lay members of the council were very valuable in helping with all of that. When our major contractor went bankrupt, our vice chancellor had enough business acumen to handle it.
Yeah.
We amazed a major Australian bank by calling in a guarantee, $250,000. I didn't ever expect that anyone would call in a guarantee.
Exactly.
And we got the university open on time. But when I say we, I had very little to do with that. I saw it happening, and the vice chancellor and Roger Johnson and later Alan Cole managing it. Do you want to talk about that interregnum period between Willett and Webb, or was that later?
Well, unless you feel that you'd like to talk about the early teaching days, with any specific issues in that, I'd like to go on to that one at some stage. Well, maybe just to sort of to fill a gap, or a perceived gap there. When you opened in 1975 and through to about, well, let's say, the very early 80s, did things go as expected, or roughly as expected, or were there major problems?
There were no major problems. Things went roughly as expected.
So till, say, 82, maybe?
Yes.
Right.
That's a set of questions you ought to especially get onto Mel Presney about, because he and John Willett used to have some very long discussions.
Right.
Do you feel like just dealing with the Mel Presney matter?
Yeah.
We did make a phone call. They can't.
So, up to the early 80s, there didn't seem to be any major problems in implementing the philosophy and the organizational structure of the university as planned by the interim council. When did that begin to change?
Well, I've never understood why John Willett retired or resigned from the university. I think he just had a feeling that his time had come. And he explained it to me in that way. He said he just felt that it was the time for him to move on. He may have been finding challenges from some of the senior staff of the university in the academic side a bit hard to handle. He once described himself to me as being a builder rather than a manager. And I can understand that. I don't think we ever really accepted downtown. On a personal level, John was not an easy person to be alongside.
When you say downtown, you mean
Take up an hand of business in the city.
Right.
And I think there just may have been an accumulation of all those sorts of factors which made him feel it would be nice to find new pastures. There was also a sense in which he didn't quite fit into Australia's Vice Chancellor laureate. He he wasn't enough old club. He was too direct in questioning. And his personal opinion of the Australian Vice Chancellor's Committee was that he behaved a bit like the lower fourth. But he wasn't your usual Vice Chancellor. I think he must have just made us get sick of it. And I find that quite reasonable. But I don't, and he's never told me absolutely directly in the forthright way.
But he decided then, I understand, to retire, and he was to just sort of catch everybody unawares with him, and that was...
Certainly distressed Ted Gray. He didn't want him to go. So then we had to select another Vice Chancellor. So we advertised for one. And the process occurred while John Lewis was still there. He didn't find that time comfortable. And I know I got the rough end of his tongue a few times for not keeping him what he thought was sufficiently in touch with the procedure for starting a new Vice Chancellor. I had the view that it was nothing to do with him, especially since he had always espoused the notion that an incumbent should have no part in the selection of his first successor. But I suppose that's the way it is, the way things would be, and I don't think I would be innocent of those feelings were I in that situation.
Oh, were you? That's another question.
So we had an unsuccessful selection process. Ted told you all this?
He did go through it. I can't remember in how much detail offhand, but yes, I think I've got a fairly comprehensive idea of it.
So the first selection failed because there was a town gown break in the selection committee. We weren't able to make an appointment. So then John Willett was on his way. We had to have an interregnum. That was a pretty unhappy period in the life of the university. I certainly was unhappy then. A very good friend of mine was the acting Vice Chancellor, Professor Robert Siegel. He and his wife, who by then was dead, and my wife and I had been good friends. We used to dine out with other people and visit one another. But Robert was very highly strung, felt very uncomfortable about telling people to do things, felt uncomfortable, I think, filling the role of Vice Chancellor because he had this strange sort of inverted notion that he shouldn't ever raise his head, and was the wrong person to have been appointed to do that job. And for me as Registrar, there was a particular difficulty that Robert didn't like going through official channels. So there was a sort of kitchen cabinet of odds and sods from around the place who tended to be the people he turned to. I didn't mind not being asked for advice, but I didn't mind when normal channels got screwed up, because the organisation has to know what's going on. And so that led to some pretty tough times between him and me, and between him and lots of other people. I think some concern by some members of the council. And the period when we alienated the state government. For example, there was an opportunity during that period to get the relocated government chemical laboratories on site. That would have been, in my view, a wonderful bonding between government and the university. And it was just at the time when the notion of sharing resources in the public sector was sensibly being tried out. And some students got the view that they didn't want the state government on the campus. And often, as is often the case in student politics, the espoused reason has nothing to do with the real reason. someone spread the word that the morgue would be coming, we'd have all these dead bodies on campus, all of this stuff which the alleged rationality of the university experience ought to deny. It was taken seriously, and Robert failed to deal with this, and in fact was rather sympathetic to not having a government agency on the university site. And I feel this was really an undischarged relic of a decade or two beforehand, that sort of thinking. So that was just one example of the very unfortunate alienation of other bodies that occurred during that period. We went out to find another Vice Chancellor and weren't doing too well. And Roy Webb came in at a very late tip and was selected and appointed.
Yes. I don't think this could be fair. Now, we were talking about the interregnum between Professor Willett's departure and the arrival and the appointment of Professor Webb. I wonder if you could sort of illustrate some of the ways in which the instability at the top, due to Professor Willett's being there but not being having a limited tenure, obviously. Lame duck VC, would that be the sort of appropriate? And then an actual interregnum. How did that trickle down through the university?
Well, I think there was a lot of concern in the university about the very long period of time it was taking to successfully get a Vice Chancellor. And I think there was also a feeling that the quite determined, forceful leadership on behalf of the university had ceased. It's very difficult, of course, for any caretaker, Vice Chancellor, to do much. But we felt, I think, in the closing days of John Willett's reign, all those natural winding down effects, the growing uncertainty in the university. In particular, it allowed the internal academic politicians a lot of space in which to play. And if, I guess in a cynical way, you feel the way I do, that the university at times can be nothing but a boarding house for academics. The academics played politics with one another, quite often with little regard for the impact they're having on the institution itself. And I don't want to overstate that, but it certainly was part of the scene. And in a university which had relied very heavily on documenting, making sure that policy was explained and well written, that people's authority was respected, that people's good ideas were valued, the general movement outside the normal processes and the normal structures during the interregnum was very unsettling. It was unsettling for a lot of the general staff. But there were a few politically inclined people who soon formed themselves into a kitchen cabinet of sycophants around the acting Vice-Chancellor. And this, of course, created a much less healthy atmosphere than should have been the case. I think it was during this time, too, that there was an acceleration in the movement away from the processes which were designed to get the Griffith philosophy established, almost culturally established. And I might say here that we all recognised, those of us who were involved in the founding of this, that to create a university which was so different from the traditional university, it needed to be cosseted and maintained for quite some time, possibly 20 or 30 years, so that you could get the culture developed which would attend to socialisation of new members of the tribe in an informal way rather than a formal way. And I think this broke away during the interregnum, largely because of Robert Siegel's embarrassment, I think, in feeling that he had the right to tell anyone anything to do.
So those set of circumstances really contributed to significant change.
It certainly opened the way for a new Vice-Chancellor to be pretty individually powerful in changing the direction of the university. I think I recognise all of what I've just said more in retrospect than I did at the time.
So, when the new Vice-Chancellor was appointed, he came into... I'm going to be a bit long-winded here, and you're well enough able for me not to put words in your mouth, so please, I'm talking out of just a very brief background. There are two ways of looking at this just from my brief research. The new Vice-Chancellor came into the university. He saw what was probably a fairly unfortunate situation at the time, and he had to fix it. That was his job. The second was that because he didn't come from a background that understood the culture of or philosophy of Griffith, he was never either. He never actually did he or did he not get into to understand what was trying to be achieved. So is it true to say that there was a situation that needed remedying it, and he remedied it in a traditional academic culture manner rather than within the philosophy of Griffith, or tried to? Is there any truth in that?
I don't think he recognised any problem early in the piece. I think his recognition of what he saw as a problem came from meetings with a few people downtown who said things to him, and he took them quite seriously. That's the best way I can work out that he saw it as a problem. He was aided and abetted in this, I think, by the opportunity of the arrival of a new Vice-Chancellor taken by some of the disaffected staff to get into his ear. And some of the disaffected staff were of a conservative persuasion, and I think he found their conservatism attractive. Okay, that's one answer. The other answer is, I'm not sure that the new Vice-Chancellor even imagined there'd be any other way to run a university than the University of Melbourne was run. And I think he also imagined that a Vice-Chancellor has much more power than a Vice-Chancellor actually does have. He was certainly very disturbed, I think, to have pointed out to him ways in which what he wanted to do were contrary to the policy of the university. And I soon formed the view that he really wasn't much interested in policy and procedures that had been set in the past. But he just wanted to steer the thing as he thought a Vice-Chancellor ought to steer it, perhaps using the Melbourne tradition more than the Griffith processes. Now, after quite a few years, he began to say things using what I would call the Griffith terminology. But an aspect of his character, I find, is that once he's made up his mind about something, he is exceptionally obdurate. Or once he's taken a position, while it may take him a long time to get to a position, once he's taken it, he's very obdurate. Sometimes this is a good thing, which means that he doesn't vacillate once there. Well, that's really an admirable characteristic, and I've appreciated it in him at times. At other times, it means that he's quite unable to be persuaded, even if a great stack of his advisors all want to try and persuade him away from a particular position. So, having made a series taken a series of positions as if the way you do it at Melbourne was the only way you would do it anyhow. I don't think he was prepared to move away from that course. So we found, for example, that many of the senior general staff who had played a very important role in getting the policy and were the custodians of the policy just became utterly dismayed to be dealing with someone who didn't seem to be even interested in carrying on the traditions or even observing the policy. And he didn't have much of a background in the recorded policy or doctrine of the university, because I discovered that at Melbourne University he had never handled a file. He was just given decision sheets. And the whole question of recording of a matter on a file seemed to be a new idea.
Given his business qualifications, I suppose it's purely academic, not practical.
Yeah. He was an economist, not a communist.
Yeah, I see.
So this led to a very, very different style of management. And a very great interest in the detail of matters. And very little interest in the articulation of principle. Whereas the university had started out very consciously articulating its principle and then deriving its processes and behaviours from a range of what I suppose would probably be called doctrine.
Theology.
Well, yes, some of us maybe. We managed to avoid more extreme forms of worship.
I can remember the very exciting sort of feel from totally outside us that many of the community felt about Griffith without understanding what it was about. There was a perception this was innovative, new and exciting. And then, of course, how you dealt with that depended on where you stood in the political spectrum, I should.
Right, yes.
Can I come back to how you've explained it in probably in well how Professor Webb was appointed, but I find it still difficult to understand how even in extremis a Vice Chancellor could be appointed without having had a clear understanding and a commitment to the philosophy of the university. You explained that was dropping off prior to the appointment of the Vice Chancellor. It's such an important appointment. Is it because, as you've mentioned, that there were a group around the acting Vice Chancellor who were able to dictate the appointment?
No. The group around the acting Vice Chancellor would have had no influence in the appointment at all.
Yeah. So it had to be the...
It was the council. A selection fee with a high number of members of the council. I was away on a period of extended sick leave while this selection went on. Talking to people about it, so it's second-hand observing this, is that they were pretty desperate. And may have fallen, this is a bit of a speculation on my part, judging from what people said, they may have fallen into the error of telling him that his responding agreeably, but without requiring re-articulation, going back to that early point. So I think there's a John Cleese film showing different ways of selecting people, in which Cleese answers all his own questions. And there might have been a bit of that going on.
So, could I bring it of men to, after the current Vice Chancellor was appointed, what were the, unless there's anything you want to add to any of that area, I think certainly, what are the key issues that have occurred since then that have impacted on the university in general?
Okay. Well, I think one of the first things the new Vice Chancellor did was to try to engage with everyone reasonably. I think Roy is a decent man, and he tried to engage with people. A lot of the people, those who subscribed to the religion he referred to a few minutes ago, of course came back at him in the manner of the religion. And I think it would be honest to say, just found this almost impossible to cope with. He's not the sort of man who was prepared to discuss those principles on which the university was founded. And soon those principles became, I think, blamed by him for what he perceived to be the lack of success of the university in conventional terms. And the two conventional terms were having a lot of people from downtown who would express love towards the university, and the second was attracting high TE score type people into the university. My own view is that any new university has a period of time which it must endure before it's been around long enough to be accepted, and that while you can do some things to ease this passage, time is a major component. And once upon a time I didn't believe that, but I now do. I think you just have to wait.
Yes.
And he didn't accept that. And I also think he was uncomfortable with the unconventional character of the university. So one of the things which happened was that gradually the old guard was alienated and pushed away out of positions of power. He, for example, wanted to have a professor at the head of every school, whereas we had, in the early days, introduced policy which said there could be senior lecturer for a while. He didn't believe that was right. And a series of moves like that. A lot of the old people, well, not old in years, but those who've been around for a while, were pushed out, away from the committees, from the offices of the university. He believed, correctly I would think, that one of the Vice Chancellor's most important jobs is to be influenced in the selection of senior academics. I think that's the right way for a chief to think. And he still did spend a lot of time working on those sorts of selections. But I and many others believe that the people who were brought in were often selected on grounds quite different than the grounds that would have been appropriate for the sort of university Griffith set out to be. And it was really to trust that with the conventional sorts of university reputation. And you'd have to say that has to be, to a large extent, successful in a conventional way. You'd have to say have been rewarded remarkably by a big increase in research performance of the university. started and for quite some time just had 4 undergraduate courses. Now I think there are over 200. And there was a deliberate policy to ape QUT and produce named courses rather than the more general courses, with a view to attracting people to vocational outcomes and also producing small categories of recruitment in the hope that you'd be able to capture more of the higher TE score people that way. There's a tendency, I think, to ignore the structural advantage of the University of Queensland, which had faculties that we didn't have, which traditionally attracted high TE people like medicine, dentistry, veterinary science, law, probably a few others that I'm trying to think of. So, other milestones, I suppose, a series of amalgamations would have to be a milestone. I think it was the right thing for the university to do. Others didn't think it was the right thing, and I separated there from some of the other old guard. I thought it was correct. In fact, at one stage, the Vice Chancellor and I were probably isolated from the university as being able to people who were trying to take over the whole schools that had introduction faculties here. And while I feel that it was inevitable that happened, because John Willard and I always made it clear that the university had been organisationally designed for a maximum population of 8,000. At 8,000 staff and students. We'd always made that clear. Therefore, there needed to be an organisational redesign when the university reached a certain size. I don't think that redesign has ever been properly done. And one of the sad things about the movement of schools to faculties was that at that time, the meaning of terminology became confused. I don't think the word thinking about it was not sufficiently thorough to work through the production of a clear set of terms which weren't confusing with existing. Right. I don't think there's anything else I need to really talk about.
That's right. What I'll do is I'll go back to the questions.
Okay. I was at the point of departure from the command of origin.
Exactly. Okay, there seems to have been a general identity of aim and interest between Can and Gan regarding the innovative versus conservative or traditional approaches to tertiary institutions on the international effort in terms of stretching specific sites, first names, culture, prerequisites, interdisciplinary details and stuff. What I was getting at there was that I couldn't say Val Presley and I mentioned it earlier, and say Ted Bray agreeing on everything, but you've answered that question. But one thing that does rise up there, prerequisites. Would you like to talk a little bit of how the university approached the question of qualifications to take the course?
Well, you may or may not know.
Okay.
Yeah, well, we began by trying to make special provision for part-time and mature age students. I think we failed. It's one of our most... Willard's triumphant handling of Commonwealth Games and the acquisition of residences.